Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Marcus Caldwell said 47 minutes before everything changed. Danielle Ross moves through the night shift at Seattle General in Atlanta with the kind of efficiency that makes her invisible. 3 weeks. 21 days of quiet competence, of 4 lines checked with mechanical precision, of patient charts organized in alphabetical order on desks that other nurses left in chaos. She wears her scrubs like armor, crisp creases running down the sleeves, the fabric starched in ways that would make a drill sergeant nod with approval. Most of the staff assumes she's just meticulous. They don't recognize military creasing when they see it. The fluorescent lights hum their endless mechanical song above polished linoleum as she enters the break room at 11:41 p.m. Her locker is in the back corner, third from the left, exactly where she requested when she started. She opens it slowly, and for 2 seconds, just 2, she allows her professional mask to slip. Her fingers touch a tarnished military challenge coin taped inside the door, the metal worn smooth from 30 years of hands gripping it in moments between life and death. The coin catches the fluorescent light and throws it back in fractured pieces. She doesn't trace it with her fingers the way she does at 3 in the morning when she can't sleep. Not here. Not where anyone might walk in. The locker clicks shut. The mask returns. Her shift briefing begins at midnight. Room for 07 is her assignment, and she already knows the vital signs from the previous nurse's notes. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, traumatic brain injury sustained 8 weeks ago, recovery progressing slower than expected, personality changes noted, increased irritability. She reads this in 30 seconds and absorbs it completely. The details matter. Details keep people alive. When she enters room for 07, Chen is awake, unusual for this hour. His wheelchair sits parked beside the hospital bed, the brakes locked, his right arm in a sling. There's a scar running from his temple to his jaw, still an angry shade of purple-red that suggests the injury is recent enough to still be processing. He watches her approach, and something flickers behind his eyes. Recognition. Not quite conscious recognition, but the kind that lives in muscle memory and neural pathways that survived when others didn't. "Evening, Sergeant," she says quietly. Her voice is soft, the kind of quiet that doesn't disturb. "I'm going to adjust your pillow." She moves with practiced efficiency. Her hands are steady as surgical instruments. The pillow is repositioned to reduce pressure on his left shoulder. The 4 line is checked for infiltration, no swelling, good color, flow rate appropriate. His chart is reviewed, pain level reported as 5 out of 10, last medication administered at 10:15 p.m., no adverse reactions noted. "You were in a unit," Chen says suddenly. His voice is rough, like gravel under tires. "I can tell. The way you move." Danielle doesn't pause. She adjusts the heart monitor leads across his chest, checking the adhesive for any signs of skin irritation. "Just trying to be efficient, Sergeant. Helps the patient rest." "No. Different." He's struggling with the words, synapses misfiring, but he's pushing through. "You move like someone who's operated under fire." She doesn't answer. The best responses sometimes aren't words at all. She finishes his vitals check, blood pressure 127/79, heart rate 64, O2 saturation 97%, and documents everything in his electronic chart. The information goes into her memory simultaneously. Details. Always details. But that wasn't the worst part. The cafeteria is empty at 1:15 a.m. except for Marcus Caldwell, who sits alone at a corner table with a bowl of soup that's probably been there for 20 minutes, untouched. He watches Danielle move through the line with the kind of predatory focus that comes from someone accustomed to power and unaccustomed to being questioned. She takes grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, and black coffee. Nothing that can spill. Nothing that can make a mess. The staff lounge comes alive at 1:02 a.m. Night shift nurses filter in during their breaks, 3 RNs from the cardiac unit, 2 from trauma, 1 from oncology. Caldwell waits until the room has audience enough. Then he speaks. "I'm making a wager," he announces, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from a six-figure salary and a name on the hospital donor wall. The new nurse. Ross. I give her 1 week before she quits. Anyone want to take the bet? The room doesn't respond immediately. Danielle stands at the coffee station, her back to everyone, filling a cup with black coffee that steams like something volatile. She doesn't turn around. Come on, Caldwell continues. She's been here 3 weeks. Quiet little thing. No personality. Bet you any of these other nurses will crack her within 7 days of real pressure. She'll resign. I'll buy drinks for whoever matches my $100. One of the trauma nurses laughs nervously. I don't know, Dr. Caldwell. She seems solid. Solid. Caldwell stands, his designer shoes clicking against the linoleum with the sound of money and entitlement. She's a ghost. No confidence. No edge. Probably never handled a real emergency in her life. Danielle pours more coffee than she needs, listening to the fluorescent lights hum above her head. Her jaw doesn't clench. Her shoulders don't tense. She simply exists in this moment the way she exists in all moments, fully present, fully aware, completely unmoved by the words being spoken about her. The cafeteria incident happens at 2:33 p.m. during Danielle's lunch break. She sits alone at a table near the windows, her tray balanced carefully, the same grilled chicken, the same steamed vegetables, a small carton of low-fat yogurt. Caldwell enters with 2 surgical residents flanking him like remoras following a shark. He moves directly to her table. How's the new career going? His smile is the kind that doesn't reach his eyes, the kind that was probably perfected in medical school when he learned that confidence could substitute for competence. Fine, thank you, doctor, Danielle says quietly. She doesn't stand. She continues eating with measured bites. You think you belong here? Caldwell's voice drops, becomes conversational in that way that makes cruelty feel like casual chat. One of the residents shifts uncomfortably. The other watches with the fascination of someone watching a nature documentary about apex predators. Danielle sets her fork down slowly. She looks up at him. Her eyes are the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic, and they contain nothing, no fear, no anger, no emotion at all. This is the mask. This is what it looks like. I'm doing my job, Dr. Caldwell. Sure you are. He reaches out and knocks the tray, one sudden violent motion, and plates scatter across the floor. The sound is enormous in the cafeteria. Chicken slides across polished linoleum. The yogurt container tumbles and leaks white across the tiles. Heads turn. The entire room becomes an audience. Caldwell's smile widens. He's found the reaction he wanted, or believes he has. But Danielle doesn't react. She doesn't stand abruptly. She doesn't raise her voice. She simply stands slowly, and her movements have a quality to them like a fighter coming off a stool between rounds. The residents sense it. One steps back. The other goes very still. Caldwell doesn't notice. He's already moving toward the nurse's station, confident in his victory, confident that this small show of dominance has marked territory and established hierarchy. It's 47 minutes later when the real humiliation begins. The ICU corridor is empty except for the sound of monitors beeping behind closed doors. Danielle is reviewing charts at the station when Caldwell approaches with a stack of patient files. His expression is theatrical, like he's rehearsed this moment. These need reorganizing, he says, and drops them. Not sets them. Drops them. 17 files scattered across the floor in a cascade of white paper that slides under the desk and spreads across the tiles like confetti at a funeral. He looks down at her from his full height, and his voice becomes the voice of a man completely certain of his power. Pick that up, sweetheart. The room has gone very quiet. The monitor behind him beeps in regular intervals. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm like something breathing but not alive. 3 nurses have their eyes on Danielle. 2 residents pretend not to watch while watching everything. She stands slowly. Her hands move toward the files, and as she bends to retrieve them, something extraordinary happens. Nothing at all. No trembling. No flushed face. No voice cracking with anger or humiliation. Her jaw doesn't clench visibly. She simply retrieves the files with methodical efficiency, stacking them in order, her movements precise as someone operating under fire. Her hands are rock steady. Scars run across her forearms, white lines that tell stories to anyone who knows how to read them. 3 of them visible below her scrub sleeves. 3 scars that suggest trauma survived, wounds endured, survival achieved. She continues working without acknowledgement. Without anger. Without fear. Caldwell waits for a reaction. He's invested in this moment. He needs the reaction. A crying nurse. A resigned nurse. A broken nurse who confirms his worldview about power and hierarchy. Instead, Danielle finishes retrieving the files, organizes them by patient room number, and places them back on the counter. Her eyes don't meet his. She doesn't say a word. She simply returns to her charting as if he's already gone, as if he's already irrelevant, as if his existence in this moment requires no acknowledgement at all. It's the worst response he could have received, and he knows it. He stands there for 3 seconds, a lifetime in social interaction, and then walks away, his clicking shoes the only sound in the suddenly deafening silence. But what Danielle doesn't know is that someone is watching from room 407. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, who has seen this exact scene play out in military bases from Kuwait to Kandahar, has witnessed what most people missed. He saw the moment her mask was applied. He saw the instant she became something other than a nurse. And he's beginning to remember why. The staff lounge smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, and Dr. Marcus Caldwell's voice cut through the space like a surgical saw through bone. 6 nurses. 3 residents. 1 carefully orchestrated audience. "I'll give her a week," he announced, gesturing across the room toward Danielle at the medication cart. "That's my public bet. The quiet mouse quits within 7 days. Anyone want to take the other side?" Nervous laughter rippled through the space, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who'd never learned the difference between mockery and humor. Danielle's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. Her hands never stopped moving. Rock steady. Methodical. She continued organizing the 4 drips as if Caldwell's voice was nothing more than background noise, like the fluorescent lights humming overhead or the distant beep of a monitor 3 halls away. Her face remained an unreadable mask. She said nothing. She didn't look up. But everyone else did. By Wednesday afternoon, the cafeteria had become a stage. Caldwell's timing was precise, 12:24 p.m., peak lunch hour, maximum witnesses. Danielle sat alone at a corner table, something she'd learned to do 3 weeks into this job. Better to be isolated by choice than isolated by circumstance. Her soup was lukewarm, her sandwich already half gone, her apple sitting untouched beside a bottle of water. She didn't see him coming. Caldwell walked past her table with the casual confidence of a man who'd never experienced real consequence, and his hip caught her tray at exactly the right angle. Soup exploded across the tile floor. The sandwich landed apple down in the spreading amber liquid. Her apple rolled toward a trash can like it was making its own escape. 30 people watched. Caldwell kept walking without looking back, his hand already reaching for something on another table as if the accident had never happened. As if she hadn't just become the day's entertainment. Danielle knelt without hesitation. Her movements were methodical, deliberate, the way someone moves when they've done harder things than clean up after a careless man. Paper towels came from the dispenser. The liquid pooled around her kneecaps, soaking through the fabric. Someone should have helped. Nobody did. She gathered the scattered food into a pile, the apple still rolling slightly before she caught it, and the room stayed quiet in that specific way that meant everyone was watching while pretending not to. Her expression never changed. Not anger. Not humiliation. Nothing. Just a nurse cleaning up a mess. Just work. Just another moment in a series of moments designed to break someone. Except Danielle Ross wasn't just anyone. The thing about someone who'd operated on wounded soldiers under mortar fire in Fallujah was that a knocked-over cafeteria tray registered somewhere around the level of a slight inconvenience. She stood, disposed of everything, and returned to work as if the past 60 seconds had been nothing more than a minor disruption to her afternoon. But Caldwell wasn't finished. Strategic humiliation requires escalation, and the following morning in the ICU hallway, he escalated. The stack of patient charts hit the floor with a sound of paper scattering, sharp, definitive, audible. 9 charts. 37 pages. All of them suddenly his problem. Caldwell stood above them, and his smirk was the kind that belongs to men who've convinced themselves they're untouchable. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the morning shift to hear. Loud enough for the residents shadowing him to remember this moment for years. And have them reordered alphabetically by 10 a.m. Think you can handle that, or is it too complicated? Her knuckles whitened as she bent to retrieve the first chart. The fluorescent light above caught the edge of her face, and for just an instant, something shifted in her expression, not visible, exactly, but felt. A tightening at the corners of her mouth. A coldness in her eyes that had nothing to do with the temperature of the hospital hallway. Then it was gone. Her face became stone again. She picked up every single sheet without a word, her movements efficient and exact, and walked away, leaving him grinning at his audience like he'd just won something important. That night, alone in the supply closet with its steel shelving and boxes of sterile dressing kits, she leaned against the cold metal. 10 seconds. That's how long she allowed herself. Eyes closed. Breathing controlled. Not anger. Anger would be a luxury she couldn't afford. Not frustration. Frustration wouldn't change anything. Just a moment of calculation, a brief pause to remember why she was here and what she'd already survived. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her scrubs, and returned to the ICU like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Room 407 was quiet during her break at 2:34 a.m. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen lay in the hospital bed with the kind of stillness that came from a traumatic brain injury, his left side subtly weaker than his right, his speech still slurred from the swelling that was slowly, incrementally decreasing. He'd been here for 6 weeks. The doctors said he was lucky. Danielle knew better than to believe in luck. She knew about survival, about recovery timelines, about the specific types of suffering that came from blast injuries and rehabilitation. She sat beside his bed, not speaking, just present the way only someone who'd seen real suffering could be present. The machines around him hummed their steady rhythm, ventilator, monitor, for pump, a mechanical symphony that meant he was alive and stable and fighting his way back. His hand moved. Slow. Deliberate. Reaching. She took it without hesitation, her grip firm enough that he'd feel it, gentle enough that it wouldn't hurt him. "Your boy," he whispered. His voice came from deep in his throat, roughened by the breathing tube he'd had for the first 3 weeks. "Kandahar. I carried him out." The words were slurred but unmistakable. Her throat tightened. She nodded once, unable to speak, unable to break the composure that was all she had left to give. Ambush. Jalabad. He was still fighting to find the words, his brain still rewiring itself through the damage. "I carried him." He turned his head slightly toward the bedside table, toward the tarnished metal object sitting there. The challenge coin. The one she'd left anonymously during his first week, slipping it onto his table while the night shift was elsewhere, a small piece of her truth that she wasn't ready to speak aloud. "You gave me this," he said. "Different deployment. Fallujah. You saved my life then too." Danielle squeezed his hand. Her other hand found the dog tags beneath her scrubs, the ones that identified her as Master Chief Petty Officer, the ones that carried her rank and service number and the official weight of a life lived in service. They were warm against her skin, hidden beneath fabric and layers of her civilian disguise. She said nothing because there were no words big enough for what she was feeling. Nothing sufficient to encompass that she'd taken this job, crossed state lines, worked these brutal night shifts, and endured Caldwell's campaign of humiliation specifically to be here. To care for this man. To repay a debt that could never truly be repaid because debts like that, see debts measured in carried bodies and honored losses, existed in a space beyond currency or time or gratitude. This was her mission. This was why she was here. Her eyes betrayed everything. But her face remained stone. 3 floors below, in his office on the administrative level, Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat beneath recessed lighting and reviewed the emergency pericardiocentesis procedure notes from 3 nights prior. The needle decompression. The ultrasound guidance. The fluid drawn from around the heart with the kind of precision that took years to develop. His hand moved across the mouse, clicking through the logs, understanding what he was reading even though the attending on-call had written the documentation. The technique was surgical grade. The timing was perfect. The outcome impossible without someone knowing exactly what they were doing. He pulled up her sparse employment file, the one that had seemed appropriately thin when he'd hired her, necessary when you were running phantom billing codes through the ICU and needed staff who kept their heads down. But this file had gaps. Employment from 2008 to 2011, redacted. 2012 to 2015, vague contractor work, location unspecified. Her references were threadbare. Her digital footprint was almost non-existent in a world where everyone could be found, catalogued, and assessed through a simple online search. What he was looking at wasn't the file of a careless nurse. It was the file of someone trained in how to disappear. He picked up the phone and dialed board member Harrison, a cardiologist whose private practice thrived almost entirely on the referrals Caldwell sent his way. A man with financial incentive to listen carefully to whatever Caldwell needed to say. "I need you to start asking questions about the new night nurse," he said, his voice careful and measured. "Patient safety concerns. Documentation issues. I'll send you some details." He hung up before Harrison could ask follow-up questions, and he began typing. Incident reports. Medication timing discrepancies. Charting errors. All of it fabricated with the meticulous care of a man who'd learned how to create paper trails that looked real because he understood the specific language that made people nervous. He backdated them to her first week. By the time he was finished, he'd constructed a narrative of incompetence that would survive initial scrutiny. By the time the investigation started, the narrative would be too established to easily dismantle. And by the time she figured out what was happening, she'd already be suspended, already be compromised, already be gone from his ICU and from the threat she represented. He didn't know what she was. But he knew she was something. And something that could perform emergency procedures with that level of skill would recognize his phantom billing codes within days. So he began his campaign in earnest, making calls to the other board members, calling in favors that had been accumulating like interest. Strategic moves. Competent moves. The moves of a man who understood that sometimes you didn't need to knock someone down, you just needed to create enough institutional pressure that they collapsed under their own weight. But Danielle Ross sat beside Michael Chen's bed at 2:34 a.m. on a Thursday, her hand still holding his, her dog tag still warm beneath her scrubs, and she made a silent promise. Whatever Caldwell was planning, whatever campaign he was mounting, she would finish what she'd started here. She would care for this man. She would honor the boy whose body he'd carried out of that ambush. And she would do it with the same composure, the same rock-steady hands, the same unreadable mask that had gotten her through 3 weeks of deliberate public humiliation without breaking. The quiet mouse, Caldwell had called her. The mouse that everyone expected to break. The mouse that nobody realized was something far more dangerous than any noise she could make. The second phone call was more delicate than the first. Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat in his office on the 7th floor of Seattle General, mahogany door closed, Venetian blinds drawing the afternoon light into thin blades across his desk, and waited for the clinic director in Portland to pick up. He knew her name, Dr. Rebecca Hutchins, and he knew she'd worked with Danielle Ross 7 years ago at a rural clinic outside Salem. He also knew Danielle had listed her as a reference. The phone rang twice before Hutchins answered, and Caldwell's voice dropped into the register he used for serious conversations, the one that made people lean in, concerned, professional, confessional. Dr. Hutchins, this is Dr. Marcus Caldwell at Seattle General in Atlanta. I'm calling regarding a former employee of yours, Danielle Ross. We're doing a routine credentialing review and I wanted to speak with you confidentially about any incidents you might recall. Specifically around controlled substance handling. He let the word sit. The silence on the other end was exactly what he expected, the pause of someone suddenly remembering something they'd rather forget, even if it was nothing at all. I'm not making accusations, of course. Just due diligence. Had you ever noticed any inconsistencies in her medication counts? Any gaps in her shift reports? Hutchins stammered something about not recalling anything specific, but Caldwell could hear it in her voice, the seed planted, the doubt blooming. He thanked her warmly, mentioned something about liability exposure and the importance of protecting the clinic, and ended the call before she could ask clarifying questions. Within 2 hours, he'd made an identical call to Washington State Hospital in Olympia, where Danielle had worked for 18 months before Seattle General. Same voice. Same careful insinuation. Same strategic ambiguity that left the listener wondering if they'd missed something obvious. The calls were masterpieces of implication. No direct accusations. No claims he couldn't defend. Just questions that sounded reasonable, professional, justified, questions that turned former colleagues into unreliable witnesses without them realizing it. By the time either director thought to call Danielle for verification, the damage would already be a shadow on her file, a whisper in institutional memory that never quite went away. Caldwell made a third call, this one to his contact at MedTrust Consulting, a firm he'd quietly invested in through a series of shell companies designed to obscure his ownership. The consultant who answered was Patricia Vance, a former hospital administrator with the kind of reputation that made people trust her immediately, professional, thorough, dispassionate. He briefed her personally, walking her through the concerns that had been raised, the patterns he'd noticed, the risks to the institution. He had documents ready. Not evidence, exactly, but something better, a file thick enough to look serious, vague enough to survive scrutiny. Incomplete medication reconciliation reports from 3 years ago. A single shift where Danielle had clocked out 7 minutes late, notation, nothing more, but with the right framing it became suspicious. A performance review from her second month at Seattle General that Caldwell himself had written, buried deep in the filing system where it would take digging to find, containing a single sentence about her occasionally distant demeanor during rounds. Patricia Vance listened, took notes, and asked one question that made Caldwell smile. What's your timeline for removal? Discreet, but expedited, he said. She's been here less than a month. Probationary period still technically active. That same afternoon, while Danielle was in the ICU managing a septic patient on pressors, Caldwell made calls to 3 people, Dr. Susan Park, a cardiologist and board member who'd sent him approximately $200,000 worth of referrals over the past 18 months through his private practice side gigs, Harrison Bennett, the board chairman whose nephew had received a last-minute fellowship recommendation from Caldwell's connections at Johns Hopkins, and Robert Chen, the hospital's legal counsel who'd been compensated handsomely for consulting services that mostly involved looking the other way when Caldwell's billing codes got creative. The calls were brief and carefully worded, but the message was clear: there's a problem with a staff nurse, the institution is exposed, and we need to move fast. Within 40 minutes, a meeting was scheduled for the following morning in a conference room on the executive level. No Danielle. No HR director. Just 4 men and the weight of institutional authority, moving with the smooth precision of people who'd learned that decisions made quietly carried more weight than any public statement. Caldwell had orchestrated this before, different nurse, different hospital, same result. The key was momentum. Get the outside investigator involved. Get the board members talking among themselves. Get the paperwork moving through the right channels. By the time anyone thought to ask Danielle for her side of the story, the narrative would already be locked in place, cemented by official procedures and the inertia of institutional concern. At 11:20 that night, Danielle slipped into room 407 with the kind of quiet that only came from years of moving through dark spaces without being noticed. Staff Sergeant Chen was asleep, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been during daylight hours. The monitors around his bed beat their steady rhythm, heart rate stable at 68, oxygen saturation 96%, blood pressure 120/78. She'd checked on him 3 times during her shift, more than protocol required, aware that Caldwell had reassigned her away from his direct care that morning with a smile that made her skin cold. The rotation policy excuse was thin enough to see through, but it was institutional enough to stick. She moved to his medication cart and began scanning the log, her eyes moving across each entry with the methodical precision of someone reading a language that revealed truth through numbers and abbreviations. Carvedilol, for milligrams twice daily, standard for post-cardiac recovery. Clopidogrel, 75 milligrams daily, antiplatelet therapy, reasonable. But there, 3 days ago, an entry for milrinone, a phosphodiesterase inhibitor that boosted cardiac output but carried risks if not carefully monitored in a patient with his history. No. Danielle checked the entry again. 2 doses of milrinone, then discontinued. No physician's note. No rationale documented. No indication in the patient's chart that this medication had been ordered or discontinued by anyone on her shift. Her jaw clenched so slightly that only she would have felt it. The rest of her face remained a perfect mask. But her hands, steady as surgical steel, suddenly felt something very much like rage moving through the tendons and muscle fibers, and she forced them to still by gripping the edge of the medication cart until her knuckles went pale. She photographed 3 pages of the chart with her phone, not because she was going to show anyone, but because she needed proof that she'd actually seen this, that this was real and not some phantom of paranoia. Then she returned everything exactly as it had been, touched Chen's shoulder briefly in the dark, and slipped out of the room the same way she'd come in. The fluorescent lights hummed their dead song in the hallway. Somewhere down the corridor, a patient was crying softly behind a closed door, the sound of someone in pain that no medication could quite reach. The next morning, when the board meeting happened 3 floors above her, Danielle was in the ICU with a patient whose sepsis line had become infected, requiring emergency central line replacement through the femoral vein, a procedure that went sideways halfway through when the guide wire caught on arterial plaque. She was so focused on stabilizing the patient, talking the resident through needle advancement at the exact right angle, monitoring the ultrasound image for the gleam of guide wire tip in the vein, watching the pressure waveform on the monitor for signs of arterial placement, that she didn't notice when Caldwell appeared in the hallway outside the glass partition, watching her work with an expression that might have been admiration if it wasn't so clearly aimed at figuring out how to break her. She'd been here 3 weeks. She'd saved Chen's life. She'd caught a septic line infection that would have killed a patient. She'd kept her hand steady through every insult, every humiliation, every test. And now, in a conference room 7 floors above her, men in suits were documenting concerns, signing documents, and preparing the institutional machinery that would grind her out of this hospital by the end of the week. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't say anything. Couldn't prove anything. Couldn't tell anyone about the milrinone without revealing that she'd accessed a medication log for a patient she'd been explicitly reassigned away from. Couldn't explain why a freshly hired nurse would know that phantom medications meant something was very, very wrong. Couldn't do anything but wait and watch and prepare for the moment when the hammer fell. The separation notice came via email at 3:47 in the afternoon, CC it to HR and the compliance office. Danielle's access to the hospital system was revoked at 3:51. By 4 o'clock, a security guard was politely asking her to turn in her badge. The monitor alarm screamed at 2:48 a.m. like a wounded animal. Danielle's eyes snapped open in the break room where she'd been resting for exactly 23 minutes. She was moving before the second alarm wail, her body recognizing the pattern before her conscious mind caught up. Room 407. Chen. The ICU corridor was a blur of motion. She pushed through the doors and the room came into focus. His blood pressure was dropping in real time on the monitor. 78/42. 65/38. The numbers falling like a stone down a well. One of the night residents, a kid named Patterson who'd been at Seattle General for maybe 6 months, stood frozen near the foot of the bed. "Get the ultrasound cart," Danielle said, her voice dropping an octave. Not a request. A command. Patterson's eyes widened. "I'll call Dr. Chen needs ultrasound. Now." Patterson moved. She was already at Chen's bedside, her hands finding his wrist, checking the pulse that was there and then wasn't quite there anymore. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but his own heartbeat was drowning in its own fluid. Cardiac tamponade. Pressure building around the heart like a fist closing. She'd seen it before, in Fallujah, in a field hospital with walls made of sandbags and a ceiling made of mortar fire, in a place where decisions had to be made in seconds or people died. The on-call surgeon was 20 minutes away. She had maybe 4. "Get me a spinal needle. 18 gauge. Patterson wheeled the ultrasound cart in, his hands shaking slightly. She was already prepping Chen's chest, her movements precise and economical, nothing wasted, every motion the result of 10,000 repetitions. Muscle memory. That's what they called it in training, but it was deeper than memory. It was DNA rewriting itself through trauma. The ultrasound probe was cool against his sternum as she positioned it, her eyes reading the screen like she was reading a map of country she'd already crossed. There, the black void around his heart, the pericardial sac full of crushing fluid. 200 cc at least. Maybe more. BP is 48 systolic, another nurse said from somewhere behind her. He's losing it. Danielle's jaw tightened, her breathing controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm she'd used under fire when the world was exploding and people needed her hand steady. The spinal needle was in her palm. She'd prepped the site in 30 seconds, sternum, 4th intercostal space, angle toward the left shoulder. Textbook. Except there was no textbook when textbooks were written by people who'd never done this while rockets whistled overhead. She positioned the needle and pushed. The resistance changed as it penetrated the pericardial sac, and suddenly the plunger gave way and fluid came back into the syringe like dark gold, like blood that had been crying to escape. She drew 200 cubic centimeters in what felt like one long breath, and Chen's blood pressure responded immediately. 62/40. 70/45. Climbing. "Push 1 epi, 4, she said, and Patterson was already doing it. The monitor showed what looked almost like a normal rhythm starting to reassert itself, the flat line becoming a heartbeat again. 80/50. 90/60. She taped the needle in place and stepped back, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her face unreadable as stone. What the hell was that? Patterson was staring at her like she'd just walked out of the Atlantic Ocean. "You just performed emergency peri, get him on continuous monitoring. I want pressures every 5 minutes. If that fluid reaccumulates, I need to know in the first minute it happens." She didn't look at him. She was watching Chen, whose eyes were flickering open, whose chest was finally moving without the desperate drowning motion. His hand reached out and she took it, a brief contact, professional, nothing more, and released it. "Stay with him. Watch the monitor. You see any pressure drop, you find me." By the time Dr. Caldwell arrived 18 minutes later, the ICU had settled back into its normal rhythm. The alarms had stopped. Chen's vitals were stable. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical song and everything looked almost normal except for the way for ICU nurses were watching Danielle from their stations with expressions she couldn't quite read. Awe. Fear. Recognition. Caldwell's face went through 3 colors in succession, white, then red, then something that looked like rage wrapped in a business suit. His eyes moved from Chen to the monitor to Danielle, and she watched his expression calculate something. She could see it happen, the moment he understood that she'd done something impossible, that she'd done it in front of witnesses, and that anyone with a medical degree would know she wasn't supposed to be able to do it. "My office. Now." His voice was quiet. The quiet that comes before things break. The basement hallway where his office sat felt colder than it should have. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a sound like insects dying slowly. Caldwell closed the door and turned a folder on his desk toward her. The preliminary investigators' report. She didn't pick it up, but she could read the header: alleged drug diversion, falsified credentials, unprofessional conduct, patient complaints. 72 hours of work compressed into a document designed to destroy her in writing what he couldn't accomplish in person. "You are suspended effective immediately," he said, his voice tight as a garrote. "Pending full investigation. Security will escort you from the premises." She opened her mouth once, a choice she made and then unmade. What was there to say? She knew the game. She'd been erased once before by people much more powerful than him. The Pentagon had made her disappear from official records after a classified mission went sideways. A hospital administrator with a fraud problem was just a smaller version of the same machine. She closed her mouth and turned to leave. "One more thing," he said. She paused at the door. "I hope it was worth it. Whatever you think you proved with that stunt in 407. Your career is over. Nobody's going to hire a nurse with this on her record." She didn't respond. Didn't turn around. The submissive posture she'd maintained for 3 weeks had shifted somewhere during the last hour, and now even her stillness carried weight. She walked out. The basement laundry room smelled like bleach and hot cotton and broken things. Danielle folded the scrubs she'd worn for the last time, folded them the way you fold things in the military, with precision and respect. Creasing the sleeves exactly. Making the stack uniform. Her hands were steady. That was the thing that no one understood about people who'd operated under fire. Your hands didn't shake afterward. Your hands were the thing that stayed true. She'd taken shrapnel in Fallujah, watched 7 men come through her triage that were supposed to die, and her hands had never once betrayed her by trembling. But now, alone under the fluorescent hum in a laundry room in Atlanta, folding scrubs that represented a life she'd tried to build outside of uniforms and shadows, her hands finally began to tremble. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 3 weeks of swallowing insults. 3 weeks of letting a man knock her tray to the floor. 3 weeks of being erased again, just like before, just like the Pentagon had done when she came back from Fallujah with classified knowledge and a body that was too useful to officially exist. She set the folded scrubs on the counter and her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from an unknown number: "I know who you are. I saw what you did in 407. Call me when you're ready to stop hiding." No signature. No name. But the message felt like a door opening in the dark. She deleted it and walked out. 9 days later, Samir Haddad arrived in the emergency room with crushing chest pain that radiated into his left arm, his breathing shallow, his face the color of old newspaper. Danielle shouldn't have been in the hospital at all. She was suspended, waiting for an investigation that would likely end her nursing career permanently, but she'd come to visit Chen anyway, taking the back entrance and moving through the halls like a ghost, which was what she'd become. Good at being invisible. Expert at disappearing. The trauma bay doors opened and the gurney came through, and the moment Haddad's eyes found her across the room, his entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. One word came out of his mouth in a voice barely above a whisper: Zanjabil. The code name. From Fallujah. From operations that were classified so deeply that even the Pentagon pretended they'd never happened. The same code name that only 7 people in the entire world were supposed to know. Marcus Webb, the hospital's security guard, a retired Army Ranger who carried his own scars and understood the language of silence, stepped closer to her. His eyes scanned her face with the precision of someone who'd been trained to recognize what was real. "That's a ghost name," he said carefully. "From the Fallujah operations." "What's your rank?" She didn't answer. Her jaw locked and her hands went still at her sides and her entire body went into standby mode, the way it did when there was an incoming threat. But Chen had wheeled himself out of his room, still moving slowly, still fighting through the neurological damage from his traumatic brain injury, and he held something up between his trembling fingers. A tarnished military challenge coin, worn smooth by time, bearing the insignia of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The coin she'd given him in 2006 after she'd taken shrapnel meant for him and kept working for 40 minutes while bleeding out. "This is from the Fallujah operation," Chen announced, his voice carrying across the waiting room like a bell striking. "Master Chief Petty Officer Ross gave me this after she took shrapnel meant for me and kept operating on 3 other wounded for 40 minutes before she'd let anyone treat her wounds. She's the reason 7 of us made it home." The waiting room had gone silent. 20 people. Maybe more. All of them watching. A tall man in civilian clothes stepped forward, his bearing unmistakable even without the uniform, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change in a room. Major General William Cross, in Atlanta for a community relations tour, his eyes sharp as surgical steel. "May I see your tags, Master Chief?" he asked formally, his voice carrying the weight of rank even in plainclothes. 3 heartbeats passed. Danielle's hands moved and the chain came up from beneath her shirt and the dog tags caught the fluorescent light and held it. Cross stepped closer and read aloud, his voice steady, "Ross, Danielle M. a Master Chief Petty Officer. Special Forces Medical. Navy Cross. Silver Star. Purple Heart with 3 clusters." The silence after those words was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. It lasted exactly 10 full seconds before Chen's voice broke it like a stone through glass. "She's the reason 7 of us made it home. She operated under fire while bleeding out herself. She's a fucking hero." The 50-year-old Iraqi translator arrived at Seattle General's emergency department with chest pain that radiated into his left shoulder, and the moment he locked eyes with Danielle across the trauma bay, his face drained of color. His lips moved before his voice followed. Zanjabil. The code name she'd operated under in Fallujah, the one that existed in classified files and the memories of 7 people who'd made it home. Only 7 people alive knew that name, and one of them was dying in front of her with recognition flooding his dark eyes like seawater through a breached hull. The security guard, a retired Army Ranger named Clayton who'd done 2 tours with 75th Regiment, overheard the whisper and stepped closer to Danielle, his jaw tightening as he looked between the translator and the nurse with steady hands. His voice came low and measured. "You're not who they said, are you? Not just a hospital nurse?" She didn't answer. Didn't blink. Just continued gathering the ultrasound probe and the 4 kit, her movements precise as a Swiss chronometer, every gesture economical and deliberate. Clayton watched for 3 full seconds, then nodded once, a gesture loaded with understanding, and moved toward the trauma room's entrance to hold back the curious eyes of residents and interns. In his wheelchair by the observation window, Staff Sergeant Chen's hand opened slowly. He'd been holding the tarnished military challenge coin for hours, the one Danielle had placed in his palm years ago in Fallujah after she'd carried him bleeding from the ambush site and spent 40 minutes operating on 3 other wounded before allowing anyone to treat her own shrapnel wounds. The coin caught the fluorescent light as he held it up, his eyes never leaving her face. The room's noise, the monitor beeping, the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, the boots of the trauma team moving to position, seemed to fall away for him. He was standing in her presence as she was standing in his, and the weight of what that meant, of who she was, suddenly made every person in that emergency department feel smaller. A visiting 2-star general, present for a community relations tour but in civilian clothes that couldn't hide the bearing of a man who'd commanded thousands, approached Danielle at the monitor station with the kind of quiet authority that made residents step aside without being asked. His silver hair was cut military precise. His posture said 3 decades of service, minimum. He didn't introduce himself. He simply asked, "Can I see your tags?" Not a request. A command wrapped in courtesy, the way admirals spoke when they already knew the answer but needed to hear it spoken aloud. Danielle's hands paused for exactly 1 second. Then she pulled the chain from beneath her scrubs. The dog tags caught the light as they emerged, scuffed stainless steel that had seen 23 years of service across 3 continents. The general leaned close enough to read the engraved details without glasses, his eyes moving across each line like he was reading scripture. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 2 decades of command experience and the kind of respect that only other warriors could truly understand. "Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Silver Star. Bronze Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross for Valor Under Fire. Fallujah, 2004 through 2007. 17 confirmed combat insertions. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He read those commendations like he was reading them from her heart itself, and with each medal, each deployment code, each official recognition of who she actually was, the emergency department went silent. Not the normal silence of a hospital, that fractured, interrupted quiet filled with alarms and footsteps. This was absolute silence. The kind that comes when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The monitor kept its rhythm. Beep. 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 The ventilator wheezed. The fluorescent lights hummed their electronic song. But no voice spoke. No one moved. The silence stretched to 5 seconds. Then 8. At 10 seconds, Chen's voice cracked the quiet like a rifle shot. Master Chief Ross took shrapnel meant for me in Fallujah. She kept operating on 3 other wounded for 40 minutes before she'd let anyone treat her. She's the reason 7 of us made it home. 7 people alive who wouldn't be without her. That's not just a nurse. That's a warrior. The words hung in the trauma bay the way smoke hangs in still air, refusing to dissipate, filling every space, changing the composition of everything around them. Danielle didn't acknowledge them. She'd already moved back to the monitor, her face an unreadable mask, her hand steady as they adjusted the cardiac leads. But something had shifted in that emergency department, something fundamental about the way the world was arranged, and nobody who witnessed it would ever arrange it that way again. The next morning, a viral video hit 400,000 views. The footage showed Dr. Caldwell in the staff lounge, his expensive suit jacket draped over a chair, his French cuffs catching the light as he pointed at Danielle with the kind of casual cruelty that came from a lifetime of believing consequences were for other people. "Pick that up, sweetheart." The phone video had captured everything, the smirk, the condescension, the absolute certainty that this quiet nurse would accept this as her role in the hospital hierarchy. By hour 6, the view count had doubled. By hour 12, it had crossed 2 million views, shared across social media platforms like a contagion of accountability, each share a small hammer strike against the walls of his carefully constructed authority. By hour 24, the video had found its way to the phone of Dr. Bernard Whitmore, a 78-year-old Vietnam veteran and cardiac surgeon who'd recommended Marcus Caldwell for his residency 20 years ago. Whitmore had been decorated for his service, had walked through rice paddies under artillery fire, had held soldiers while they bled out, and he recognized something in that video that made his hands shake with rage. He watched the clip 3 times, each time his jaw getting tighter, until he couldn't look anymore. He sat at his desk in his home office, mahogany and leather, the office of a man who'd built something meaningful in his life, and he typed a letter. It was short. It was precise. It was the kind of statement that ends careers. I am ashamed to have once vouched for Marcus Caldwell. His treatment of a decorated Special Forces veteran represents everything wrong with modern medicine. Respect is not earned through cruelty. Leadership is not demonstrated by humiliation. I hereby publicly disavow him and call for immediate board review of his conduct, his billing practices, and his fitness to practice medicine. He signed it, scanned it, and sent it to 3 addresses simultaneously: the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Seattle General Board of Directors, and the State Medical Licensing Board. Then he poured himself a drink, bourbon, neat, the color of old copper, and he waited for the world to answer. The board convened an emergency meeting within 48 hours. What happened in that meeting happened the way structural collapses happen, not suddenly, but inevitably, each revelation a support beam giving way beneath the next. Board member Harrison tried to defend Caldwell. He'd benefited from the referral schemes, had reasons to protect the arrangement they'd all quietly agreed to. But the hospital attorney presented evidence that felt like a prosecutor laying out a mafia indictment. The MedTrust consulting investigator, the one Caldwell had hired to manufacture the case against Danielle, had received $42,000 in payments from a shell company with Caldwell's name buried in the LLC paperwork. The incident reports against Danielle had metadata showing they were created 7 days after her suspension began, not before. The backdated documents were so obviously fabricated that the attorney didn't even need to elaborate. Everyone understood what they were looking at. Then came the forensic audit of ICU billing codes. Phantom procedures. Charges for medical devices that were never opened. Surgeries logged under patient names that matched no admissions. Offshore account transfers totaling $470,000 over 18 months. The money had flowed out of Seattle General like water through a broken dam, and every transfer led back to accounts bearing variations of Marcus Caldwell's name. Harrison's face went gray. Dr. Park immediately recused herself and requested that the board formally refer Caldwell to the State Medical Board for investigation. The vote was unanimous. The walls were collapsing in real time, each revelation another support beam failing. By evening, Caldwell's attorney advised him to resign immediately. By the next morning, his medical license was suspended pending formal investigation. His wife filed for separation. The country club quietly revoked his membership. The local news ran the story for 5 consecutive days, and it always opened the same way, the clip of him saying "Pick that up, sweetheart," followed by the image of Danielle's dog tags glinting under the Trauma Bay lights, followed by the general's voice reading the commendations for valor. The narrative was already written. The town had already decided. Caldwell stopped leaving his house. He stopped returning calls. His lawyer sent statements. His publicist released rebuttals. Nobody was listening anymore. The story had moved past him. The world had moved past him. 6 months later, Danielle Ross stood in her new office on the 4th floor of Seattle General. A bronze nameplate read Director of Trauma Services. Her dog tags hung openly over her scrubs now, not hidden beneath layers of deference. They caught the light when she moved, a constant visible reminder of who she actually was. Staff Sergeant Chen walked in without his wheelchair. 3 months of physical therapy had nearly restored him to full mobility, and he saluted. His hand rose in that precise motion, fingers extended, a gesture of respect from a subordinate officer to a senior warrior. She returned it slowly, her hand rising with the kind of grace that came from doing this same gesture 1,000 times before. The first genuine smile anyone had seen from her crossed her face like sunrise breaking through clouds. Across town, Marcus Caldwell sat at a folding table outside a discount shopping mall, wearing a cheap clip-on tie and a polo shirt with an insurance company logo. His medical license was permanently revoked. His offshore accounts were frozen in litigation. The expensive Italian suits were gone, sold to pay attorneys. He handed out flyers for supplemental health policies to people who avoided eye contact, and most of them kept walking. A former colleague from the hospital passed by, recognized him, and kept walking without slowing her pace. When evening came, Caldwell packed up the remaining flyers and drove home to a studio apartment where he sat alone, scrolling through job postings that required skills he no longer possessed, his phone dark with silence. That same evening, Danielle gave a speech at a veterans hospital fundraiser. She spoke about the 7 soldiers who came home. She spoke about Chen. She spoke about the invisible wounds that civilians never see, the quiet strength of people who've already survived the worst the world could throw at them. When she finished, she spoke just 7 words: "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." The room rose in applause so thunderous it shook the chandeliers. Chen stood in the front row, still holding that tarnished military challenge coin, tears running down his face. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please hit subscribe and share this with someone who deserves to know their own strength. Like this video, and comment below, what would you have done in Danielle's position? Thank you for watching.